The flashing red light on the digital lock was clinical. I stood on the snow-slicked porch of the masterpiece my late husband Ryan and I built. My keys were dead. It had been exactly 5 days since his funeral. Through the thick glass, my mother-in-law Susan sneered, her muffled voice declaring I had no claim, that Ryan had left me nothing. Freezing wind cut through my black morning coat, but I did not shiver. I did not pound on the glass. I did not scream. Panic is a useless currency, and I refused to spend it here. I simply turned my back on the multi-million-dollar house I had helped build from the foundation up. Walking away from 15 years of marriage, erased in 5 days, required a specific kind of mental accounting. Ryan used to tell me a story about a structural collapse early in his career. He was trapped inside a concrete tunnel for 14 hours. The extraction did not happen until the 15th hour. He told me that, in the dark, with the weight of the world pressing down, the men who screamed ran out of oxygen. The men who stayed perfectly still survived. That became his operating protocol for life. Panic is a luxury for the unprepared. Standing in the freezing driveway, I realized Ryan's perpetual quietness during our toxic family gatherings was never submission. It was a long-term investment strategy. He was the architect assessing the load-bearing walls of his narcissistic family, waiting for the right moment to pull the support beams. For years, Susan and his brother Logan had mistaken my own silence for weakness. They thought they had chained me with the invisible shackles of a survivor, assuming my lack of retaliation meant I suffered from learned helplessness. But surviving a toxic family is not about absorbing their blows. It is about studying their patterns. This invisible chain they thought they had wrapped around my neck was actually my tether to reality. My silence was not submission. It was observation. It was data collection. Every insult, every slight, every financial manipulation was a data point logged and filed. Society often looks at the survivor of relentless emotional abuse and assumes their stillness is compliance, but for a strategic mind, that invisible chain is a carefully measured perimeter. I sat in the driver's seat of my car and turned the key. The heater roared to life, melting the ice on the windshield. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon a feeling of betrayal or heartbreak, but the ledger was perfectly balanced. There was only clarity. They had officially terminated the social contract of our family. They thought they had locked me out in the cold to freeze, emotionally and financially, but they had simply handed me the ultimate freedom. I did not cry. I did not ask why. I put the car in drive and let the tires grip the icy pavement, moving away from the property without a single backward glance. Anger was not loud this time. It was entirely clinical. The tears they wanted from me were a tax I refused to pay. My survival did not require their permission, and my retaliation would not require their presence. I drove until the sleek architecture of our neighborhood faded into the industrial grit of the city limits, pulling into the parking lot of a dingy, neon-lit motel right off Interstate 17. The lobby smelled of stale cigarette smoke, old carpet, and cheap disinfectant. It was the furthest thing from the custom Italian marble and imported hardwood I had walked on that morning, but it was secure. I booked a single room, locked the deadbolt, and pulled the curtains shut against the blinking red vacancy sign. I did not lie down. I did not check my phone for missed calls or apologies that would never come. Instead, I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out the heavy, encrypted black dossier. Ryan had given it to me 2 weeks before his heart gave out, with strict instructions not to open it until the dust settled. The dust had not just settled, it had calcified. I placed the dossier on the center of the worn mattress and broke the seal. Inside was not a collection of sentimental goodbyes or poetic reflections on our marriage. It was a meticulously organized corporate and legal vault. This was Ryan's masterpiece, a blueprint of pure, unadulterated consequence. I flipped through the heavy parchment pages. The first section contained the original, notarized land deeds. They proved, unequivocally, that Ryan had purchased the property entirely with his independent capital 16 years prior, long before Susan or Logan had ever set foot on the estate. The second section contained ironclad trust documents, establishing an impenetrable legal fortress that named me as the sole, uncontestable beneficiary of his entire estate. The final item was a single handwritten letter on Ryan's personalized stationery. It was not a love letter. It was an executive summary. Abigail, the letter read. My family operates on the currency of intimidation. They believe volume equals power. Do not argue with them. Do not mediate. I have spent the last 5 years quietly auditing their assets and removing their safety nets. They think they own the board, but I have already removed their pieces. When they inevitably try to push you out, let them. Let them lock the doors. Let them claim victory. Then, execute this dossier and let them hang themselves with their own corporate greed. I ran my fingers over his sharp architectural handwriting. Love, in Ryan's vocabulary, was not expressed through grand romantic gestures. It was expressed through airtight legal protection. He had seen the hostile takeover coming, and he had structured my defense so flawlessly that no lawyer in the state could dismantle it. I closed the dossier. The motel room was freezing, but a deep, resonant warmth spread through my chest. This was not a grieving widow planning revenge. This was a primary creditor taking inventory of her newly acquired empire. The transaction was clear. Susan and Logan had breached the contract of human decency. Now, it was time to collect the penalty. Deep within the second compartment of the dossier, I uncovered a secondary layer of documentation that shifted my entire understanding of the situation. This was no longer a simple property dispute over a house. It was an absolute corporate checkmate. Ryan had not just protected our home. 24 months before his death, operating through a series of shell companies, he had quietly purchased 100% of the distressed corporate debt belonging to Susan and Logan's family construction empire. The very company they used to flaunt their wealth, the business that funded their luxury vehicles and country club memberships, was heavily leveraged and completely insolvent. I spread the financial spreadsheets across the cheap motel bedspread. The math was breathtaking in its brutality. Susan and Logan did not just live in a house they did not own. Their entire corporate livelihood was sitting on a financial guillotine. The debt was legally bound to a private trust. A trust that was now controlled entirely and exclusively by me. This is the ultimate power illusion of an empty wallet. Narcissistic individuals like Susan and Logan confuse the performance of wealth with the reality of ownership. They believe that if they speak loudly enough, drive the right cars, and wear the right clothes, the universe will simply bend to their projected authority. They mistake the possession of material things for actual character and capital. But their status was nothing more than a highly leveraged shell rented with money they did not have. They possessed the illusion of power, but I possessed the balance sheets. The realization washed over me with clinical precision. They were currently sleeping in my house, entirely unaware that the roof over their heads and the company that funded their arrogant lifestyle belonged to the woman they had just locked in the snow. They were operating on a negative balance, emotionally and financially. My relationship with them was no longer familial. I had been the silent investor in their twisted version of a family, footing the bill for their arrogance. Now I realized their affection had always been a subscription service, and their credit card had just declined. There was no sadness left in my system. There was no despair over the loss of a family I never truly had. I meticulously packed the documents back into the black dossier. I did not need to scream or cry to claim my space in the world. I held the legal right to completely liquidate their existence. They thought they had engineered my ruin by locking a door, but they had simply locked themselves inside a burning building while I held the only key to the exit. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. Tomorrow, the eviction notice would not be delivered with emotion. It would be delivered with a stamp. At 8 o'clock in the morning, operating with surgical precision, I drove downtown. The sky was a sharp, cloudless blue, matching the exact frequency of my mindset. I parked outside the sleek, glass-walled offices of Laura, one of the most ruthless and top-tier private trust attorneys in the state. I bypassed the receptionist, having already secured an emergency appointment, and walked directly into Laura's corner office. I did not offer pleasantries. I simply placed the black dossier and Ryan's certified death certificate on her polished mahogany desk and slid them toward her. Laura spent the next 45 minutes reviewing the documents in absolute silence. When she finally looked up, there was a glint of profound professional respect in her eyes. She did not suggest emotional mediation. She did not ask how I was feeling. She simply turned to her computer and began drafting a formal, unarguable legal response. Within the hour, we had compiled a devastating package: certified copies of the independent land deed, the sealed trust documents, and a formal notice of unlawful entry regarding the smart locks they had illegally altered. Citing multiple missed payments that Ryan had quietly documented and allowed to accrue, we added a formal notice of default on their corporate debt, legally calling in the loans. At exactly 11:15 in the morning, the files were dispatched via priority legal courier. An hour later, I was sitting in my car, sipping black coffee, when my phone screen lit up. It was Logan. I let it ring 3 times before hitting the accept button. The explosive narcissism on the other end of the line was instantaneous. "Who do you think you are?" Logan screamed, his voice vibrating with frantic energy. "You think you can forge some fake documents and steal our company? Susan is calling the police. We are going to destroy you." I let him expend his energy, listening to his panic spike as reality collided with his entitlement. He threatened lawsuits. He threatened exposure. He threw every desperate insult he could formulate. I waited for him to pause for a breath. "The corporate debt is due in 30 days, Logan," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. "A formal 30-day notice to vacate the property has also been issued. Any damage to the architecture will be deducted from your remaining personal assets." "You listen to me, you pathetic." I cut him off mid-sentence and tapped the end call button. I blocked his number immediately. I blocked Susan's number. I denied them the one thing they craved more than money: emotional fuel. I refused to be their audience. The panic they were currently experiencing was not my responsibility to manage. This was not revenge. It was basic accounting. The liabilities had been identified, and I was simply closing the accounts. I put the car in drive and merged into traffic, leaving their frantic, echoing demands in the silence of my blocked caller log. Susan and Logan's desperate attempt to file for an emergency injunction brought us to a preliminary hearing just 3 weeks later. It was remarkably brief and entirely stripped of the emotional theatrics my in-laws usually relied upon. The courtroom was vast, smelling of lemon polish and old paper. I sat beside Laura at the plaintiff's table, my posture straight, my expression an unreadable mask. Across the aisle, Susan and Logan looked visibly diminished. Their tailored suits could not hide the frantic, hollow panic in their eyes. Susan's attorney, a man who looked like he knew he was steering a sinking ship, attempted a desperate claim of undue influence. He spun a loud, dramatic narrative, claiming I had manipulated a dying man into signing away his family's legacy. He relied on volume, hoping to substitute noise for evidence. Laura did not raise her voice. She simply stood up and systematically dismantled his entire argument with clinical efficiency. She calmly laid out the evidence, submitting a chronological timeline of Ryan's financial maneuvers. She presented medical evaluations conducted by 3 separate neurologists, confirming Ryan's complete mental acuity at the time the trust was established. She provided independent witness testimonies from banking executives. Finally, she submitted the indisputable corporate debt transfer documents. The paperwork was immaculate, detailing every asset and liability down to the final cent. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. This was the silent regret of the watchmen, fully realized. Ryan had spent years quietly observing their theft, their cruelty, and their boundless greed. He had not intervened with loud arguments or empty threats. He had watched, recorded, and meticulously planned this exact moment. He had carried the heavy burden of knowing his own family was parasitic, and he had translated that silent grief into an inescapable legal snare. He had been the watchman, and this courtroom was his final, undeniable verdict. The judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for frivolous litigation, reviewed the paperwork. She looked over her glasses at Susan's attorney, shaking her head. "This is one of the most airtight trust structures I have ever reviewed," she stated, her gavel striking the sounding block with a sharp crack. "The contest is dismissed with prejudice. The trust stands, and the corporate debt is fully executable." Susan gasped, her hand flying to her chest. The reality of her sudden, complete poverty crushed the breath out of her. She stood up and fled the courtroom in humiliated silence, unable to face the public documentation of her own ruin. Logan lingered at the exit. I looked at him, and for a fraction of a second, our eyes met. He was completely hollowed out by reality. The arrogant executive had been erased, leaving only a bankrupt man facing the total liquidation of his life. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply turned back to Laura and signed the final execution orders. The transaction was complete. On a brilliant April morning, the air crisp and smelling of pine needles, I walked up the stone steps of my home. The snow had long since melted, leaving the architectural lines of the property sharp and pristine against the spring sky. I walked alone. The driveway was empty of Susan's luxury SUV. The house was completely silent, purged of their toxic presence and echoing demands. I reached the front door and punched a new sequence into the digital keypad, a code only I possessed. The lock clicked, a welcoming, heavy sound, and the heavy oak door swung open. I walked into the foyer, my footsteps echoing on the imported hardwood. The space was immaculate, finally belonging entirely to me. I walked into Ryan's old study and sat in his leather chair. I opened the heavy black dossier one final time, running my fingers over the edges of the trust documents. I turned to the last page of his handwritten letter, reading the final line that I had previously skimmed over in the dim light of that cheap motel. "They think you have nothing," Ryan's sharp handwriting read. "I made sure you have everything. I closed the dossier and let the silence of the fortress wrap around me. I've come to realize that surviving a war you never asked to fight changes your fundamental architecture. We are often taught that justice must be loud, that setting boundaries requires screaming matches and dramatic confrontations, but the most unshakable boundaries are built in absolute silence. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from their narrative. I did not forgive them for their cruelty, but I forgave myself for the years I spent believing their treatment was a reflection of my worth. They had mistaken my quiet loyalty for weakness, failing to understand that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the absolute mastery of it. I had spent years subsidizing their illusion of a family, but I had successfully liquidated the asset. Now, I own my space, my peace, and my future, free from the heavy, invisible chains of their expectations. My retaliation was not born of malice. It was born of a profound, radical self-respect. If this story resonated with your own journey of setting boundaries, drop a comment below, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories on justice, strategy, and self-worth. Thank you for listening, and remember, your truth doesn't need to be loud to be completely unshakable.